So, as my title suggests, I will try within my presentation to only look upon just certain observations following the name of this panel, cornerstones of my paper regarding the decline of sovereignty in contemporary public international law. So, first things first, so that oh, this doesn't work. It should. Okay, great. So I point here. So first of all, before we talk about the decline of sovereignty, we have to understand its importance and significance within the concept and the system of the contemporary public international law. And for a reason, the element of sovereign power remains that crucial, basic constitutive element of every state as a subject of public international law. As we call it in the theory, it remains as a certain specific differential specifica element that differentiates states for all the other subjects and entities within the public international law. But then, to answer this question, what is basically that differential specifica element? I approach within my paper the concept of sovereignty purely from the conceptual standpoint. Why? Because I find it to be a very complex and multidimensional thing within the system and your organism of public international law. And therefore, I think that it's the best way to approach it from conceptual point, from which then we derive certain definitions regarding and depending on the concrete legal context of international law about which we are talking. And therefore, we are going to accept this from this conceptual waypoint. Nonetheless, great. As this concept in the system of the public international law, as for many other crucial questions within our international public international law, we have to look to the UN Charter and the fact that the organization and its members, in pursuit of the purposes stated in the Article 1, shall act in accordance with the following principle. And in the first place, we have this principle of the sovereign equality of all member states. Why is this important? Public international law functions, as I intentionally said a couple of times, as a system, as an organism, meaning that every single norm, rule, principle, and I would personally even add values, has its rightful and definitive place within that system. And then there is a good reason why this principle of the sovereign equality of all the members comes at the first place. Talking about what this sovereignty might be, and with that I will conclude this introductory systematic part of my presentation, maybe it's best to refer to it as a certain quality of the state power, which goes both inwards and outwards. Inwards about the absolute authority that a certain state has within its boundaries, and externally looking, as our professors back home will say, that there is no other power above state in the international arena but international law itself. Coming to the conclusion that we basically have these two main aspects of sovereignty. But regarding and staying true to what I said, sovereignty does have many faces and many aspects, and therefore I just only wanted to list some of them, and I won't bore you with them, but I will kindly stop at these two moments. The idea of absolute sovereignty is outdated in the modern international community. Intertwined, interdependent, we cannot talk about the classical approach to absolute look at sovereignty. That idea, and I share this opinion in theory, is considered to be outdated. And it remains an ever-evolutive concept. And the best evidence of this is the growing role that other entities have in the modern international arena, such as primarily other subjects of international law being international organizations, and other entities. Maybe the best example would be transnational corporations. Moving on. First point, first process that I deemed and I analyze in my paper that affects modern sovereignty in this negative concept of its decline is the process of globalization. It stands with national sovereignty in relation of inverse proportionality. What does that mean? The ever stronger this process of globalization gets and evolves, we can basically debate more and more about the state sovereignty decline. Why is this? Because markets became global and thus capital also became interdependent, making this inverse proportionality, to keep it short, basic principle in this sense. This leads to a certain pull away from this classical state-centric system and introduces certain new actors about whom I talked already, so I won't bore you with that. So this is very interesting. On the list of the top 100 entity revenue lists, more than half are not states. This is very interesting. And when I opened the list, it was around 70 different entities. And what is a really interesting correlation, that the power of sovereignty that a certain state holds stands in a correlation with the entity that is not a state but holds a very high place on this 100 entity list. Basic example could be maybe United States of America, and very close on the list, Walmart as an American company. So states in these conditions tend to adapt to interest of the transnational companies rather than vice versa, which could be maybe a more natural way of things, and also testaments to the topic I'm talking about. So the next point, to keep everything within this time frame, is the idea and the principle of non-intervention. Well, the idea of non-intervention is as old as international law, and its roots can be found already in the UN Charter, but also certain other acts, but I will not talk about that right now. But what is very important is that the conceptual transition of sovereignty in the 90s, which is the period that people always, in theory at least, take as the peak of this intervention, is the key moment that we can talk about the principle of non-intervention actually being the principle of intervention in certain situations. And I would like to really point out, especially for the concluding remarks, that intervention is not necessarily negative. The core idea is protecting of certain peoples and groups in situations where this state sovereignty, especially in that interior moment, can become too violent against those that is intended to protect and represent. So, and the most practical aspects of this in modern area are the humanitarian intervention and both responsibility to protect. But I will write about that more in the paper, so I will be moving on. The very interesting aspect of the modern state national sovereignty and its decline can be tied to the most devastating weapons known to mankind, that are both nuclear and thermonuclear weapons, and its interesting correlation to state sovereignty. Why? Firstly, it transcends state sovereignty. It is an area of very important international interest. Best testimonies to this are the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the much more recent Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty. It is the instrument of sovereignty and power preservation. The best evidence of this is the crucial power that the nuclear states hold in the modern world. And this cascade effect that arises from this instrument of sovereignty and power preservations can be found, and they both affect state sovereignty, on one hand in the nuclear deterrence doctrine, on the second part, nuclear umbrella doctrine. To conclude this slide, I would like to cite one author that says that the nuclear weapons represent both symbols of status, statehood, and sovereignty. Moving on. So, next point, sovereignty in international organizations. Well, the very conceptual idea of the United Nations, which I talked about a bit earlier, is limiting sovereignty in exchange for achieving global peace and security. Key articles in this sense are both Article 2-4 and Article 51. The first one, of course, referring to the ever prohibition of threat or use of force, and the second referring to this inherent right to self-defense. This is a very interesting topic, and I will conclude this slide with this, that basically, even though, for instance, membership to United Nations is considered formally voluntary, it can be argued that is basically not. Why? Because if you, as a state, choose not to become a member of United Nations, you expose yourself to many risks of being excluded from the modern international community and all the social, political, economic consequences that bears with it. So I will remain that short. Of course, there are different levels of limiting sovereignty depending about which state is concrete example. For instance, we cannot talk about the same limitation of sovereignty of the permanent member of Security Council and maybe some other state that is not in that same position. So, and the most glaring example of this is the system of collective security. Moving on. So, to actually make this organic connection with the last slide, we have this moment of configuration in subjects in contemporary international law that does consist from both states and public intergovernmental organizations. I won't elaborate too much on this. I will just talk about 2 points. The fact is that they definitely can represent either membership within those organizations, and their goals can either represent the instrument of covert implementation of national interests, something that is in theory known as certain masked interventions of the most dominant members of the certain organizations, which is important for the final moment of my organizational aspect of this topic. It can also be a part of the sovereignty strengthening for some lesser influential states. And finally, my topic, the sovereignty decline. Why this is natural? Because all the states that are members, firstly of the United Nations, but of all the international organizations, have to adapt to the interests of the organizations they're becoming members of. Case studies in my paper, refer to United Nations, European Union, and North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I won't bore you with this, but I will be moving on. So to actually talk about the moment of the European Union as such, what is interesting, I will focus both on EU and NATO. In the paper, I focus more on the United Nations as well. But the very core idea lying within the integration process, within the EU, lies within what is called the functional integration, that the states within the old continent can face the challenges of the modern age better and more prepared through the process of integration, especially within the framework that is offered by the European Union. And one of the key sovereignty problems here is finding that needle, thread, upon which you walk as a member state regarding the amount of sovereignty you delegate to European Union and its institution, and the amount of sovereignty you're able to keep for yourself. And this is very important because decline of sovereignty of a candidate and a later member state is a crucial step in both successful and complete EU integrations. And to conclude this slide, what helps both this, on one hand, process and on the other hand, problem is what is called in theory differentiated integrations, where state through the integration process, which can, especially after its reform, last for years, negotiate with the European Union about the concrete example of their state sovereignty decline in concrete case. And that is very important, and that is why it is also very hard to pinpoint accurately, say yes, in these examples, states give their sovereignty to EU. Why? Because it doesn't have to be same for every single EU candidate and later member state. So moving on, hopefully moving on, to talk about this last aspect is the relationship between sovereignty and its decline and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Well, as we all know, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, resides upon the Washington Treaty. And in the literature, I found many articles to which different professors and authors refer to as the articles that could affect sovereignty of state parties to the Washington Treaty. The one that is most dominantly present and the one that I think is the most important for the purposes of my presentation is, of course, the Article 5. Why? Because the parties, according to this article, agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. And this is very important in the modern public international law and system of modern international relationships, in which states try to balance at every single step how will they approach both bilateral and multilateral, diplomatic and all other relationships with different states. And this is in that concept very important. So there it goes. So some final concluding remarks. Concept of sovereignty remains a dynamic, evolutive pillar of international community. Why is this moment very important? Because as the arena of international relationship changes and shifts between states, international organizations, other entities, it is very important to keep a close eye to what happens to state sovereignty during those processes. And that is why it is very important to round up my presentation and to go back to the very first step that came after hello, and I hope, hello, my name is Nikola. That is that this is a concept from which we derivate and deprive other definitions, demanding and depending is a better word, from concrete international legal context. Second conclusion is that sovereignty varies depending on which state wields it in its international arena. We cannot say that, for instance, the sovereignty which, I don't know, state which, as we talked about it earlier, a permanent member of the Security Council has the same influence as, I don't know, some state in, I don't know, South America, Europe, and something like that. Why? Because its influence in the first case is greatly at a bigger step. So in that sense, it is always very important to remain contextual and to study these aspects of decline of state sovereignty also in the context of the concrete state we are talking about and analyzing in, once again, concrete international legal context. Third, even though international organizations have taken a significant role, that only changed states' approach to fulfilling its national interests and realizing full sovereign power. What is the basic thing behind this concluding remark? Even though international organizations and transnational corporations have become much more powerful and much more present in international arena, always the cornerstone of public international law resides with states. They are the central subjects, and they will, just like water, always find a way to adapt to the processes of decline of sovereignty which are brought naturally by evolution and progress of public international law. And my final conclusion is, whether its decline is positive or negative is mostly a question of values. Evolution of, and this refers to the point where I added, okay, this is not system only of norms, rules, but it also has some values. Whether state decline in contemporary public international law is positive or negative can be highly debated. What is very important is that we acknowledge its existence and presence and then move on from that. It doesn't necessarily have to be a negative thing because of the values we talked about, the UN Charter, for instance, that are implemented in its very being and very tissue of it. But on the other hand, it can be viewed as a negative thing. Why? I intentionally said that earlier, because states remain central to the system of public international law. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.